Hello, and welcome to Felt Matters, a brand new podcast on all things felting, brought to you by the education team of the International Feltmakers Association. And we're your hosts, and both keen feltmakers. I'm Vivienne Morpeth, coming to you from sunny Lincolnshire in England.
And I'm Heather Potten, in the lovely city of Edinburgh in Scotland. Before we get started, we'd like to tell you just a little bit about us. And when I say us, I mean the International Feltmakers Association. Whether you're a seasoned feltmaker, are at the beginning of your felting adventure, or have just popped in to see what we're all about, you'll find we have a lot to offer. Our website at www.feltmakers.com has an extensive gallery of feltmakers and their websites, an events section where you can find felting workshops and exhibitions, both in person or online, and our own mentored Discovering Feltmaking courses. There's so much more that I won't mention now, so why not have a look for yourself? After this episode, of course. And follow us on Instagram and Facebook for the latest updates. One of our features in the podcast is Vivienne's Felt on the Shelf, and we have an extensive book list on the website for you to browse through to find useful books on feltmaking. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll find this podcast and a range of feltmaking videos. But that's just a selection. Become a member of the International Feltmakers Association and log on to the members area on the website. There, you can access all our specially commissioned videos, talks and conversations with acclaimed feltmakers such as Fiona Duthie, Anna-Mee Kernan, Wendy Bailey, Judith Porch and so many others. Last but definitely not least, our journal, Felt Matters. Members receive 4 issues a year, but there's so much more to explore. In another of our regular features, I dip into the archives. As a member, you too can lose yourself in this comprehensive collection of journals going back to 1986. And there you have it. Resources, inspiration, and a sprinkling of magic, all at your fingertips. But while you're here, why don't we get on with the show? And as usual, we're talking about why felt matters. I dip into the archives, Vivienne returns to the British Wool for Feltmaking book, and then together we discuss our approaches to running workshops. The name of this podcast, as you know, is Felt Matters, and the reason for it is quite simple. We decided that it would be an audio companion to our very successful journal. So as you probably know, this journal is quarterly and is available to all members, and it can be also bought from our online shop. What you might not know is that the first journal that was produced for the International Feltmakers Association was called Echoes, and it was first published in April of 1986 for a cost of 20 pence. So time has passed, and in fact Echoes was the name of the journal for many, many years, and it wasn't until 2007 that the name changed to Felt Matters. As the years passed, it was clear that this journal was an incredible resource, and it's true. We've called this a dip into the archives, this feature. And it's always a little bit dangerous for me because I don't just dip, I dive head first. And then I get so excited by all the people who have felted before me, names that I recognize, names that I don't. And they're so inspiring. All through the years, people have been innovating and pushing boundaries, which is in fact what they called the first AGM that I went to in 2011 was, all about pushing boundaries. And I think that's something that feltmakers are particularly good at. So it was clear that we needed to collect all of these issues and archive them and make them available to the members. So in fact, the archive was created in 2022, and I was lucky enough to be on the committee at that time as the communications officer. So one of my jobs, my main job, was to make sure that the new website was an amazing resource for everybody that wanted to come and visit and learn about felt making. And that is when the archive went online, and it's now available to all of our members. So there are 154 issues. That's, a fair number. When it came to looking at where I would start with dip into the archive, I decided to go through my own issues. And as I mentioned, I joined the IFA in 2011. So my first issue of Felt Matters is issue 104, which was the September issue. And as I went through all the copies that I have, I've now got 51 issues. So I've been here for a while, and I maybe have about a third of the full range of our journal. What I loved about it when I went back through the issue was the number of articles and the different areas that the articles came from. So I'm from Scotland, and I was delighted to see that there were so many articles from Scottish feltmakers, but of course from England and across the water from the USA, from Latvia, Italy, Armenia, Australia, and France. So it's always been a very international organisation. The topics as well are as far-ranging as they are now. Anything from mixed media, from wearables, sculptural felt, accessories, innovation. In this case, it was to do with laser cutting. The revival of lost skills, which is a really interesting one, because if you think about where felt making originated, you would imagine that a country such as Armenia would be one of those places where felt making was thriving. But according to the article in this issue, it had completely disappeared. And so international felt makers, including from Holland and other countries, visited Armenia and took the skills back to that country, teaching the teachers who would then pass on their skills to the children, and with any luck, revive this incredible craft. As the name suggests, the International Feltmakers Association is just that. It is very international. And one of the things that really caught my eye about this issue 104 from September 2011 was the artistic felt path. It's an exhibition of felt pieces which are installed on a beautiful woodland trail, so that anybody who wants to visit the area in Bolzano, northern Italy, can follow the trail, get some fresh air, and admire all kinds of wild and interesting pieces of felt. So when I was looking at this, I thought, well, I wonder, that was a 2011. Is it still in existence? What's happened to it now? So I went onto the internet and discovered that there's now a new felt art trail, which was just set up in 2023, so last year. And it has 25 artworks. And it means that the whole spirit of felt making and nature and wonder carries on and is still going strong. And then, of course, the next thing I knew, I was looking at trains and hospitality and what kind of hiking there is. And you never know, I might even have organised for my next holiday. As you know, Vivienne and I are both part of the education team and are heavily involved in our online courses discovering felt making. So you can imagine how interested I was to find that in this issue 104 from September 2011 is an advert which talks about a new IFA felt course. So that is the first time that the IFA had actually talked to the members about creating a new course. It wasn't online at the time, of course, but it is now. And I remember that I went to the next AGM in 2012, and there was a lot more talk then about this new course that we were going to be starting for our members. So that was quite a while ago, but it's become a reality now, and that's really quite exciting.
I'm talking about the British Wool for Feltmaking book, published by the Crowood Press and available from most good book suppliers. And I've talked about the general layout of the book and the contents, and now let's look inside and look at the details that would be really useful for us as felt makers. So the book is divided into 4 main sections when it's talking about the different breeds and how the wool works. And of course it starts with fine wool, moves on to medium wool, and then medium coarse wool and coarse wool. And by dividing everything into these 4 clear categories, we can build up our knowledge on the kind of structure of wool. And so even in these different fibre structures of wool, there's different lustres and textures and length of fibres and so on. So it's not divided according to that, it's divided according to the structure of the wool. And then as felt makers, we can see how we can use it and use it for various projects. So what is really interesting that each wool fibre that is discussed in these 4 chapters has been analysed with close-up photographs of a finished piece of felt and factual details about both the wet felting and needle felting. So somebody has very kindly, in this collaborative team that has created this book, has made samples of each of the fibres available, and they're all uniformly made. So they start off with 20 by 20 centimetres using 5 grams of wool, and they're felted until they're fulled, by which we mean that you can't pull the fibres very easily from the surface. And interestingly, they say that there's slight variations depending on whether the wool has been commercially processed or whether it's been hand washed and carded from a raw fleece at home, which is a fact makes perfect sense, but I hadn't thought about beforehand. So by looking at all of these samples, we can immediately see the variation in the shrinkage. And what is really great is that needle felting is included as well. So there's a wet felted sample and a needle felted sample. And the needle felted sample is a closely felted small heart, a 3-dimensional heart shape. And it shows the sense of the fibre versatility, the length, the hair, whether it's hairy and it has a lustre, whether it needle felts compactly or there's an openness and you can see between the different fibres. And also there's recommendations for use. And in fact, the section on Portland wool has a beautiful life-size needle felted pigeon. And so there's a lot of creative examples as well. And so various makers have shared their samples so we can see an end product. So, for example, coarse massum wool has been used in shibori wrapping technique. And again, another coarse wool teeswater has been used to create a beautiful wedding dress, which you may well have read about in Felt Matters journal. But here in this book, it's contextualised amongst other fibres, which gives us more information. And there's a beautiful felted bag with a cracked earth design in dark grey cheviot, which is a medium coarse wool. And there's a very interesting project that took place a few years ago on the Isle of Wight, and it's a yurt building project. And it was led by a felt maker with a community group, and there is involved to hand dyeing the fleeces beforehand by the artist, and most of it was felted with blue-faced Leicester, and many schools and community groups took part to make this beautiful yurt, and they drew on local ideas, and they also incorporated local fleeces. And because the project required the artist to do many other aspects as well as teaching and the hand dyeing and so on, the local fleeces were actually sent to be machine scoured and carded, and then they were used in between the layers of the blue-faced Leicester to give insulation and structure. And I think what I drew from that was that it's a really good way to use natural fleeces, because sometimes our local fleeces aren't, well, certainly here in Britain, a lot of them medium coarse, and so they don't necessarily make the fine projects that we might be looking to make if we wanted very lightweight pieces, but they're brilliant also for incorporating in between layers. And this is another way of working with natural fleeces. So this book is full of inspiration and photographs, and then the details of how each fibre, each fleece will felt both with wet felting and with needle felting. And of course, it concludes with a list of suppliers and a glossary, which is great because, you know, even as experienced felt makers, do we know the difference between a hog, a gimmer, and a shearling, and the guard hair and kemp? Well, it's all there in the glossary for us to discover. So this is the British wool book the British wool book for felt making, and published by Crowood Press, and it's available from all sorts of good wool book suppliers. And yeah, it's one I've enjoyed reading, and I'm going to keep it on my shelf, so it's going to become part of my Felt on the Shelf. I think I'm going to be dipping in and out of it for quite a few years to come yet. Let's chat about workshops, because you do lots of workshops, and I was given one last weekend, and you'd given me some really good advice last week about analysing it, and we've just been chatting about that, and I was talking about worksheets.
Yes.
What do you do?
Well, I don't hand out worksheets, and I think the reason for that is based on my experience as a language teacher, where we used to give lots of handouts. We used to photocopy, and I'm quite sure people don't do that as much now as they did at the time. And you'd hand out lots of these useful notes or worksheets and so on. And when the class got up to leave, very often those worksheets would still be lying on the table.
Oh, really?
And you'd think, well, that was a waste of paper, a waste of time. And it's obviously not made any impact because they haven't interacted with it. They haven't created it. And therefore, they don't value it. So, and I have occasionally come up against people being upset that I haven't given a handout. But I ask people to take notes. And I know that that's not always easy for people. And I appreciate that. And you can always, there's ways that you can get around that by the time you come to the end of your workshop. Sorry, you were going to say something.
Oh, yes. Well, I'm the opposite. I always give out worksheets, and they take a lot of preparation, and I put photographs in them. And for quite a few years, I've gone to my local printers here in our town, and I've had them colour printed. So it's a financial investment as well. And I've even put them in nice folders. But you kind of wonder what happens to those when they get back home, and whether they just go on the shelf. So I do agree with you there.
What I like to do is because I ask people to take notes, and I give them time to do so. And if they don't like to take notes, then take photographs, because nowadays, of course, most people
absolutely
have photographs, and they can even take little video.
I'm all for photographs.
I think that's useful.
It's such a transformative process. I always suggest to students that they need to photograph it as they go along, because when they go out with a finished piece, and my workshops are often very project-based, so when they go out with a finished scarf, nobody's going to know how it started off with this beautiful, light, fluffy wool.
I think
sitting on the table.
I think that's one aspect of it. I think I'm looking at it from a slightly different point of view.
Mm-hmm.
I think from the learning point of view, if you follow a worksheet or you just follow directions from your tutor, then you're not necessarily processing what you're being told or what you're reading.
Yeah.
So what I like to do is to ask people to take their notes and, give them time to do that, but then to work from their notes. So rather than sort of putting their hands up, miss, how do I do this and how do I do that? I will sort of direct them to, well, what did you write down here? And they say, oh, I can't understand that. And I guess that could take a bit longer, But in the end, then I think they will have processed the techniques and the process better than if they haven't engaged with it. And the second thing that, sorry, I'd like to suggest is that
I'm itching to jump in there.
Yeah, I know.
Sitting on my hands.
Oh, well, you sit on your hands just for another moment. Is
Keep going.
the fact that if you're in a workshop, you'll very often have people who are a little bit more experienced than others or whatever. If they have written their notes and one person gets a bit further on, then they can teach the next person who's looking at their notes and saying, okay, so what does this mean? They don't necessarily have to come to you, the tutor, but they can go to their peers. And quite often, if that hasn't happened naturally, I will perhaps suggest that so-and-so who's got further on down the line can then turn back and help the person who's a little bit further back. And so all of that reinforces the learning.
Oh, that's so interesting. We're obviously, we come at it, we're coming at the same subjects, but we're coming at them differently. And I think that teaching, we all learn so differently. And we learn, some of us are visual learners, some of us have to learn through movement, some of us can learn by writing things down. And I find I don't remember key words unless I actually write them down. So I'm often sitting there with my little notebook, even when I'm chatting with friends, writing things down. Some people just write straight onto their phone, they keep their notebook on their phone. And other people are busy taking photographs. And some that can just follow instructions. But I have noticed that if I give out a series of instructions and I go more than 4 or 5, then some learners, and probably myself as well, I can remember the first 2 or 3, and then I'm floundering a bit and I'm looking around the workshop to see what to do next, or I'm asking my neighbour, which is where your talking with your peers comes in.
I think my training as a teacher was in English as a foreign language. And I am very pleased that I did that, because I think it's one of the most interactive teaching styles there is. When you're learning a language and you have to communicate, that's the whole point. So you do a lot of pair work, group work, interaction, peer teaching, and so on. And I think that's probably where my confidence, in a way, because, you need to be willing to interact with your class, with your group. You're not just standing at the front and demonstrating and then they get on with it. You are part of the group. You are walking around with them, and you're not just saying, how are you getting on? You're kind of looking at what they're doing and getting them to talk about what they're doing. And so that...
Yes, so they're repeating what information they've absorbed, so they're processing it.
Yes, and they're using the language. And I have also asked students to demonstrate something they've just done, or they're in the middle. I've got some lovely photographs of a group where they were working with resists, and one woman had got a piece with about 3 or 4 resists, and they hadn't done this work before.
Yes.
So they all came around and watched as she cut into the resists, and also all the colors were revealed, etc. And everybody's, sort of leaning over, and it was taking photos, and that creates such a good dynamic in a group.
Absolutely. And a bit of tension and excitement and experiment.
That's right.
Yes. I mean, I'm a Steiner school trained teacher. And so my teaching is very hands-on and very working from memory as well. But I still think that having worksheets is quite nice the next day to have a look through. And it also depends on the length of the workshop, whether it's a 1 day or a week long, because it's going to take longer to process and it's going to be more in depth. And I noticed that quite a few people like to have resources in the information pack as well, where to buy things from, source things, how to make things. So I find I put different things in different worksheets. But some workshop organizers insist on having worksheets. So I've given workshops at various shows where it's part of the criteria that it is included. But of course, you can decide what you're going to put in it. And I always make my worksheets just almost a list of action points. And I say, you'll have to have been on my workshop to be able to follow this, so that it's actually referring back to their memory and they're having to recall the situation.
I think, yes.
Just taking it in deeper.
I can see that as well. I mean, I think there are various different approaches. What I do like to do is that as I'm giving out tips and as we are learning and things come up and we discuss the best way to approach things, I will note all of these. And at the end of a session, then I'll have a full feedback session in which everybody...
That's a very good idea.
Well, people will, I ask them to, if possible, to just stop what they're doing and we kind of all sit round and we just talk about the tips. And by this time I've collated them all. So I have written them all down and then we sit around with our notebooks or recording and we talk about everything that's been learned through the workshop and how it can be used in the future. So although I might not hand out a given worksheet, they will have one to take home by the end of it, but they will have created it as a group.
And how that's a really useful bit of advice for workshop teachers. And how do you feel about being videoed when you're giving that feedback, that resume at the end? I've noticed that quite a lot of people now will choose to video, those experimental moments that you mentioned when you had lots of the situation that you were talking about earlier, and you had a multi-resist piece.
Yes.
Or your resume. How do you feel about that?
I think this is something that does come up quite regularly in workshops about privacy. And, I remember being at a workshop with Catherine O'Leary and asked her if I could take photographs. And also I wanted, at that time, I was writing a blog in my website. So I asked if she would mind. And she said, no, absolutely. This is a workshop that I've published a book about it. I present this workshop regularly and I've moved on. I'm doing different things.
Absolutely. So that's quite clear, isn't it?
Yes.
And I'm with Catherine O'Leary there, where I think if you're going to run a workshop, I mean, there's that old saying that you need to have made it yourself 100 times or spend 100 hours working on that technique. But the fact that she was ready to share it is the important thing. And I think that also comes across in the generosity of the tutor.
Yes.
If the tutor is feeling a bit protective of their intellectual property and they're happy to give the workshop but don't really want to share the whole package, then that comes across in that sort of slight intellectual and information caution. Whereas from what you're outlining, Catherine was happy to share everything because she had moved on.
Yes.
And she'd written about it. And the purpose of the workshop was to teach the whole technique and for people to be immersed in it.
Yes. Yes. And I think that's what I think you need to discuss that with yourself and say, well, if I'm going to be a tutor, my reason for doing that is to help people to be the best that they can. And I think as for me, I know that I don't know everything. And I think one of my mantras at the beginning of every session is that I don't know everything, but I'm willing to help you find out.
Yeah.
That's my job.
And to be open to learning yourself.
Of course. Gosh, no. Yes.
Because we have students who are highly skilled and, advanced in different techniques beyond ourselves coming to our workshops.
Of course. Yes. Yes. And the reason they're coming to your workshop isn't necessarily because they don't know how to do what you're teaching them. It's they want to, well, apart from anything else, just be with other people who are interested in the same things that they are. But no matter,
it's such a joy.
Yeah. But no matter how skilled you are, you will always learn something from another feltmaker.
Thanks, Heather. That's been a great chat. It's been so interesting to hear you dip into the archives and to share that journey back in time, really. And we hope that you've enjoyed the view of the British wool Feltmaking book and feel inspired to have a look or look at similar books along those lines, working with native fibres. It's been great as well to talk about running workshops. We could do that all day long and probably much longer than that. But in the meantime, it's goodbye from Heather and myself. And until our next episode of the podcast where felt matters.
This podcast is brought to you by the education team of the International Feltmakers Association. Conceived, hosted and produced by Vivienne Morpeth and Heather Potten. Editing by Heather Potten. Music by R.T. Williams. Graphics by Vivienne Morpeth.
If, like us, you'd like to hear more from our amazing felting community, subscribe at the end of this episode. It helps other creatives to find us, and each episode will drop into your podcast platform for you to enjoy.